Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Someone asked me if I could do a little review of the strengths and weaknesses of timeline therapy. And I'm happy to do so. And it's very easy for me to share my opinions on timeline therapy because I have a lot of experience with it. In fact, Tad James, the creator of timeline therapy, was my second NLP trainer ever. My first NLP trainer back in 1997 was a guy in Norway called Mike Shakanowicz. And then the next year, I did 3 courses with Tad James, practitioner, NLP practitioner, master practitioner, and trainer training in 1998. I also assisted on a trainer training in 2001. I did timeline therapy trainers training. I did hypnosis trainers training with Tad James. And I also attended 2 courses of Hawaiian Huna in Hawaii. So I have a lot of experience with Tad James's material and Tad James's teaching and timeline therapy. There's a lot I could say about Tad James and his teachings. In this particular video, I'm going to stick to timeline therapy specifically. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? According to me, obviously. And how I adapted them and kind of think I improved upon a lot of it. And also how I evolved into a stage where I no longer at all practice timeline therapy. So I'll give you the rationale behind that. So when you do timeline therapy, which is essentially strongly NLP based with a kind of psychoanalysis bent, you're using the construct of a timeline to help people to either release a negative emotion, remove a limiting decision, and or solve a conflict, or to allegedly help someone create the future that they want. So, and I should also point out that timeline therapy is taught in the context of NLP trainings. So let's start at this. So what Tad used to teach was to do what he called a detailed personal history. And he would recommend that people could spend 2 to 2.5 to 3 hours doing a detailed personal history. And this is not at all typical in NLP, right? Because in NLP, people are usually very much focused on the process, not on the content. So this is a deviation from what people usually do in NLP. But during the detailed personal history, and I'm not going to go through all the questions, that would be too long a video, but it's essentially a detailed exploration of the person's past. When the problems seem to originate, various significant events in the person's past, their childhood, their parents, what secondary gains they might seem to have by engaging in this particular problem or issue. If you really wanted to go to town with it, you would also elicit meta programs and values and goal statements for how you wanted things to be different. So you could spend a lot of time on this. Now, initially, timeline therapy was my bread and butter thing. And I have to say that I saw some miracles using timeline therapy. I was able to help quite a few clients release deeply seated phobias, multiple phobias, deep depressions, at a time where I was very inexperienced and didn't really know much. So both due to Tad James really emphasizing timeline therapy as the thing, and also because it provided an outline or a system for what to do, that a person who's not very skilled and doesn't have a lot of experience, may be able to utilize. So for quite a while, I would actually engage in these detailed personal histories with clients. On the plus side, sometimes with some clients for some issues, it can be useful to explore their past and to try to see the correlation between what's going on in their life and this particular symptom and issue. And at times you might be able to get some good quality information that might be relevant in helping that particular client, especially if you're working with things at the level of content. So this also depends upon how you actually work with clients. Um, Also, by doing this, a client can feel deeply understood and seen and heard by you spending that much time eliciting this information. And if the client really feels seen, really feels heard, really feels understood, that can contribute to a good change work relationship where they're very receptive and very open to how you might help them. So these I think are the potential pros of working that way. The negatives in my mind is that it just takes a shitload of time. And I have found that when I skip doing the detailed personal history, my results with clients actually got better, not worse, a lot better. A second minus with timeline therapy is that it too much emphasizes the past and past events, and having someone invest in that in the office kind of implies that their past and their past so-called past events are truly important. It gives these things a significance that I don't think it warrants, and it can contribute to people really investing even more in those stories, because ultimately we don't really experience a past or a past event. We experience thoughts in this very moment. Another thing too, and I don't really do regression or that sort of memory work anymore either, but what I discovered was that when I did this stuff, when we were successful, what would appear as memory constructs would usually not be the stuff that people had mentioned during the detailed personal history. It would usually be something else. Not something repressed, but something like, oh, I haven't thought about that in 30 years, or I never made that connection. But now that I do, I see the logic in it, and they have some sort of insights. So the more people invest in telling their story, the more that can paradoxically kind of get in the way of people making those sorts of discoveries, because they've already kind of invested in what they're supposed to discover. So I no longer do detailed personal histories. Um, what I changed it to was that I started to just become very curious about when people experience their particular symptoms. So when is this occurring? Under what conditions? What are the emotions? That would be my main thing after a while when doing that sort of work. Tad James also used to, as part of the detailed personal history, talk about the prime directives of the unconscious mind. And he had 20 that he had kind of made up, that he also encouraged us to go through with our clients. And I used to do that as well, and that also takes a shitload of time. Um, as things have progressed for me over the years, I never use terms like unconscious and conscious minds anymore. I don't presuppose an entity like unconscious mind that has all these functions and purposes. And by no longer doing that, the work actually got easier, not harder, easier. That's been my overwhelming experience. You know, presupposing a thing like or entity like unconscious mind that has these particular functions or purposes, I mean, it can be useful if you're doing it for strategic reasons in an attempt to evoke certain capacities. I'm not saying that there can't be a usefulness in it. But what can happen, like I remember when I studied New Code NLP, sometimes people would get this religious relationship almost to their unconscious mind that had to be consulted and could then give signals or communicate things through involuntary signals. And I remember seeing people who often would say, yeah, you know, I was in doubt, but then my unconscious mind said this. And it was almost like a secular version of listening to very religious people claiming that the voice of God had spoken through them. Of course, the notion of an unconscious mind can also easily become an alibi or an escape hatch, like my unconscious mind made me do it, or I need this communication with my unconscious mind for something to change. So, in my experience, vastly, things have gotten better and easier when I no longer presuppose those things. Um, Moving on, so what Tad would do is that he would help people to elicit a timeline, where the idea here is that our future is stored in a particular location, perhaps back us, and the future is in front of us, or the past might be to the left and the future to the right, something like that. I don't think we really have timelines that are being elicited. I think they're being presupposed and kind of suggested into existence by the questions that are asked and the frames. So that's the first thing. I don't think timelines are elicited. I think they're suggested into existence. However, if you're going to do memory work, like working directly with memory constructs, the notion of a timeline can be a very useful construct to organize your experience and to organize it differently. So this exercise that they did where they would elicit the timeline and then have you do a trial run of kind of floating the timeline back and forth, that's very useful if you're going to do memory work, because it helps you to have a distance in regards to the memories and to have some flexibility around that. So that's something that I always took with me in memory work. So that's a good contribution. Although Tad James was probably not the first person to presuppose timelines. You had people like Steve Andreas and others who would do that before Tad James came onto the scene. But that's another topic. Now, then usually you would use timeline therapy then to, I think the term therapy is a misnomer too, because you're not curing or healing anything. You're working with thoughts and emotions, right? But it would be about releasing a negative emotion. So releasing anger, fear, hurt, guilt, sadness, these sorts of emotions. Where I found timeline therapy to really excel is whenever someone would bring what you could call an old emotion, an old way of responding into a new context. As in, every time I walk into that context, it's like I drag these old emotions with me. So consider the vast difference between someone who goes into a hotel, sees the door of an elevator, the door opens, they contemplate stepping in, and they see a guy with a knife who threatens them, and they feel fear and they take off. Like, that's not an unreasonable response. You're seeing something in this moment that you, in a very valid way interpret as threatening. Timeline therapy is not going to change that sort of response. But if you walk up to the elevator and you push the button, the door's open, there's no one in there, you contemplate going in, and you start to panic, there's obviously nothing going on here and now that justifies a fear response. So you could say that this person may have a habit of, for the last 10 years, whenever I go into those sorts of spaces, I just panic or I just feel fear. For these sorts of things, I found timeline therapy to often, not always, but quite often, be very effective. So you would ask this question where you would ask, what's the root cause of this particular thing, which when we resolve will allow this thing to clear. And what would very often emerge was some memory construct from a pretty early age that would usually be earlier than something the person had consciously told us about. And this was really useful too. So what Tad James would teach us is to float above and before the event, so that we're like above the event and before the event, looking towards the event from like the position it hasn't happened. There's something about doing that allowed a lot of people to just release emotion, and often to release what seemed to be a chain of emotion. There's something about position 3, what he called it, that particular temporal shift, that often made it very easy for people to release emotion. I don't know quite what that is. None of the explanations that he gave really resonated that much, but it very often worked. A drawback with all of this, of course, is the presupposition of a root cause, the idea that events create our experience, and the strong emphasis on childhood events. Those are the drawbacks. And in the question too, this is interesting. He would ask, if you were to know, was that very first event before, during, or after your birth? And then the person might say after, like take the first thing that comes up, trust your unconscious mind. The person might go after, or during, or before. And if it was before, it would be like in the womb or before. And if it was before, it would be, was it in a past life or handed down to you genealogically? Now, if you look at memory research, the evidence seems to point strongly to the notion that before age 2.5, 3, we don't really generate autobiographical memories, right? So anything that's claimed to be remembered before then is probably complete fiction, right? And sometimes people would claim past lives and these sorts of things. I have to tell you, I don't believe in past lives. Of course, I can't claim with certainty that there is no such thing. I've never seen a case or read an argument that I think makes a compelling case for the existence of past lives. Now, Tad would claim that by opening up for the possibility of past lives, that you're just opening up for and respecting the client's model of the world. I disagree with this, because the day I stopped even presupposing it as an option, it never happened again. I'll say that again. The day I stopped presupposing the existence of it by asking such questions, it never happened again, right? So I don't think there's any good reason to even presuppose such things. Now, to play devil's advocate to my own argument, I I did see one person once resolve an issue after having done, I'll say, a past life's timeline therapy session, where what I think happened is I don't think she re-experienced an actual past life, but I think that her mind kind of created a metaphorical scenario that was kind of isomorphic, kind of structurally similar to her current issue. And by solving it as someone else metaphorically, that changed her actual issue. So sometimes, it can be a way of metaphorically helping people solve something, but by creating something that's kind of similar, but not quite that. So in the instances where that sort of stuff is useful, I think that might be what's going on. Now, there's a claim in timeline therapy that you can release all fear or all anger or all sadness. You're not doing that. You're not releasing all or the person's capacity to feel these emotions. What you may do is that you may release an emotion connected to a particular issue or to a particular context or a set of contexts. Sometimes, if you're damn lucky, you do a timeline therapy session or a regression session, and the person gets way more than they bargained for. So I remember once I saw a client who I made a video about this for an issue, and he ended up quitting drinking. He quit cocaine use. He was no longer angry. Like it was just this cascade of changes that came from working on one thing. I remember another client I saw who had a fear whenever someone looked her into the eyes, and we resolved that. But all these other things happened. Like, she had been deeply grieving her father for many years, and that completely resolved. And she spontaneously quit biting her fingernails. And so sometimes through association, you can end up getting changes that are very, very generative. That does happen on occasion. But you're not releasing all fear and all anger and all. Tad would have a kind of new age bent, where he would say things like, there's only one emotion and that is love, everything else is an illusion. I don't think these sorts of claims hold up. And I think if you're working currently, I think the way he thought of emotion as something being stored, it's an old way of viewing emotion. I think today you'd be way better served by reading a book like How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, who essentially argues that emotions aren't triggered, they're constructed. We actually create them through a combination of body sensations and stories and meaning making. So that's a recommendation. Now, he would also help people to release limiting decisions. And a very provocative question, like, when did you decide to create this, could often evoke emotion and evoke something in people. So sometimes viewing something as a limiting decision could be useful. Now, when Tad worked with various diseases, for example, he would claim, ask, when did you decide to create this? And of course, if people have bought into the frame and they're just going to trust whatever comes up, most people would answer something. And Tad would use that as evidence that the unconscious mind always knows when they chose to create something. I, I don't think this is a claim that actually holds up. I think that as a result of buying into the framework, your mind is making a best guess approximation of what it could be. You know, I think it's more suggested into existence in that way than something that you're necessarily discovering. I have to say too that I met a guy once on a Tad James course who his wife had seen Tad James for brain cancer and she had a remission using timeline therapy. I met the family members of a woman who had severely struggled with fibromyalgia, who made a complete recovery from that. So there are many cases of people getting some good results doing timeline therapy, even if the model itself is kind of outdated. So, for example, the way Tad talked about memory had a strong bent of memory being something that's stored in the body and something that you can kind of activate and then release. Um, I think today, if you read up on memory research, it strongly points in the direction of memory being a reconstruction, and that information after the fact, our current moods, our current expectancies, our motives by remembering, the context, a lot of these sorts of factors go into us creating a sort of best guess. But that best guess could look very different if you were in a different mood or in a different context, or if you did it the week after. So I'll give an example of this. There were some memory researchers who asked a bunch of people after the Challenger accident in the United States the day after, very detailed questions about, where were you when you heard about it? What did you feel? Who were you with? So on and so forth. And people would say, oh, this is terrible. I'll never forget this for the rest of my life. And 3 years later, they tracked down the same people and they asked them the exact same questions. And only a few of them had the exact same details. In 25% of the cases, none of what they now said matched what they said 3 years ago. So you're not, and any therapist, or not any therapist, but many know that if you, for example, interview a person who's deeply depressed about their childhood, and you write down, you take good notes, and then a few months later you do the interview again when they're no longer depressed, not only will they recall their childhood differently, they'll recall very different things. And they're going to believe that they're telling you the same story, right? So there's a very good chance that what a person discovered as a root cause this week might have been something completely different in a slightly different mood, different context, 2 weeks later. So timeline therapy can work, or I should say, people can generate changes while going through that process, but probably not for the reasons that Tad James and other timeline therapy teachers claim that they are. There used to be there's a technique there called visual squash to help solve conflicts and secondary gain. I have to say I never really found that very useful. I never use it. There's also a technique there to change your timeline. Now, again, I think mostly timelines are suggested into existence to begin with, but on occasion, something like that can be useful. So I remember I saw a client once who was very depressed, and I hadn't really elicited a timeline at that point, but I noticed his kind of analog markings. And when he talked about his horrible past, he pointed to it as if it was in front of him. And then the future was even further in the same direction. And I asked him, and he said, yeah, that's how it looks. So imagine whenever you think of a future to kind of construct it through these very negative memories. Like, no wonder you're depressed, right? So I had him change his timeline so that the future was behind him and the past was behind him and the future was in front of him. And that made a huge difference to him. His depression instantly lifted. So that's a dramatic. But these are the sorts of things you can often help people do with an NLP background if you know to kind of look for where people spatially put things. Tad James would also claim that timeline therapy always works, as long as you follow the instructions and you're congruent about changing and stuff like that. I did not find that to be the case. I had like a 50-50 hit rates, I think, of people who could relate to it or not. Remember that it's what the client sees and hears and discovers that generates the change. It's not the technique. But every type of process that you do with someone requires certain abilities in the client. So being able to follow the instructions requires certain psychological abilities. And like everything else, people vary in terms of to what extent they've developed these particular capacities. So there are many people, even if you do timeline therapy or hypnotic work, where it's not going to be a good choice. And any teacher who kind of claims that this is the shit, this is what to do with every client, it's not good advice. It's not accurate. Now, one thing that really helped me to improve my results, so when I moved more into hypnotic regression stuff, and I'll put regression in quotation marks because you're never really regressing. Initially, I started to do a Dave Ellman hypnotic induction before the timeline work, and I found that improved things for me. And I think it's due to people relaxing, focusing, going into something of a hypnotic state, a bit more of it than when you just do the timeline elicitation. But what really helped me was when I started to do instant inductions, like the hand drop. I never do this stuff anymore, but when I used to do that type of work, we do a hand drop induction. And the reason why this was useful, I think, is because a hand drop, a kind of instant induction, it's kind of sudden, it's kind of surprising, it's a bit shocking, and that's congruent with evoking emotion. And I discovered that if we worked on a particular issue and we could evoke an emotion that was unconsciously generated, meaning not consciously decided upon beforehand, that often helped. And it really helped to evoke emotion and to use the emotion as kind of an affect bridge to construct some memories to then resolve, right? So I ended up using timelines, using instant inductions, using affect bridge, and keeping position 3, as I mentioned previously. That was my way of kind of updating timeline therapy. Now there's a couple of other things too. Tad had a technique to eliminate anxiety, which he recommended clearing fear first. And when you eliminate anxiety, then you would float out into the future 15 minutes after the successful completion of an event and look back towards now and ask, where's the anxiety? Where did it go? And this could sometimes be useful, but there's a trap here. And the trap is that the idea that you have to visualize or imagine things turning out successfully to not be anxious. So, because what I also discovered was that people could do that and still be anxious. And what I then discovered was that because they demanded a guarantee that things actually turn out that way, while knowing internally that they don't have that guarantee. So when I started studying rational emotive behavior therapy, Albert Ellis' system, and I really started to look for people's musts and needs and shoulds, that kind of started to spell the end of a lot of my regression work. It started to really taper off because that's where the magic very often lied. Finally, Tad claimed that you could create your future exactly the way you wanted it. Like you could put a so-called future event into the timeline and have it turn out that way. I experimented quite a bit with this. I did this quite a bit with clients. My findings was no. Like that did not ring true in my experience, and it did not ring true in my client's experience. So one of the issues I have with many of the teachings too is the absolutistic thinking around it. This always works. This is the thing to do. That lack of nuance, the lack of critical thinking, the emphasis on past lives, and a lot of new age mumbo jumbo being thrown into it. I discovered that the more I let those things go, the easier my work became. So those are my thoughts on timeline therapy. I should mention that I don't do hypnotic regression work anymore. I don't do timeline therapy work anymore. There's several reasons for that. One reason is that we never actually experience the past. This is a myth. And you can help clients have that discovery for themselves. We don't experience a past. And we never experience a past event. And we never experience a future or a future event either. So my work is revolved around very often helping people to discover that they're not actually experiencing a past. They're not actually experiencing a past event. That they're actually experiencing, that there's actually a thought construct appearing in this moment, but the fact that you think it means that you're not experiencing it. So a lot of my work are thought experiments to help people see through the magic tricks that are generating their current suffering. So I find in my experience that helping people see the illusory nature of thought and to help them to not build a seemingly stable self out of these thought constructs gives me a lot more bang for the buck. So anyways, I hope this was useful. I would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback, wherever you find this. If you're looking to make a change or for any mentoring, you can reach me at provocativhypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.